This spring, Governor Kathy Hochul requested a federal disaster declaration for fruit farmers in New York who saw their operations impacted by frost conditions in April following an early bloom. The state estimates these producers have an estimated economic loss of more than $30 million, and a disaster declaration from the U.S. Department of Agriculture would allow them to apply for low-interest emergency loans. For more on this situation, as well as a look at disaster declarations in agriculture more broadly, we're joined on the Capitol Press Room by Richard Ball, a Schoharie County farmer who is also the Commissioner for the State Department of Agriculture and Markets. Welcome back to the show, Commissioner.
Thanks so much for having us back. Appreciate it.
Well, it's our pleasure. So I'm familiar with disaster declarations from the federal government that might say help a community rebuild after flooding or help homeowners after a tornado comes through and rips up their neighborhood. But I was not aware of requests for a disaster declaration from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So in your decade plus running the State Department of Agriculture and Markets, what types of events may have led to these requests, and how common does the USDA grant this type of disaster declaration?
Unfortunately, it happens fairly often. Sometimes it's a snow event where we've had, for example, you remember Buffalo getting 7 feet of snow on a couple of occasions, and barns going down, and livestock being lost, things like that. Sometimes it's a tornado. Sometimes it's a flood event. But unfortunately, we're generally looking at a disaster declaration somewhere in New York State a little more frequently than we would like. Probably averages one a year, maybe. Sometimes there's a couple in 1 year.
And I know that in the aftermath of the April frost, you visited some of the Hudson Valley farmers in early May to see firsthand kind of the damage that producers were facing. So in this case, what sort of loss was there? Is it just that crops are ruined and are not going to be able to produce anything meaningful, or is there other damage that they're reckoning with?
Largely it's fruit loss, because upstate New York in the Albany area, we had you'll remember a few days in April when we hit 80 degrees, mid 80s. In the Hudson Valley, specifically the lower Hudson Valley, they were in the upper 90s. So many of the fruit blossoms present at the time really came out a little more into bloom. And unfortunately, on April 20th and the subsequent day, they had 23 degrees and 24 degrees in temperature at a time when the fruit was very vulnerable. And so the losses down there are anywhere from 100% loss to maybe 80% losses in a certain area. I would point out that it was even worse in some regards in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Maryland, and Delaware as well, because, again, their fruit was just that much more advanced, so much more vulnerable to a cold night.
And in this case, it's my understanding that a disaster declaration would allow impacted farmers, if one is declared, to apply for low-interest emergency loans. Is that the only type of relief that comes with a disaster declaration, or does the federal government make grants or other assistance available if there's a disaster declared?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that go on there. If there's some indemnification, if there's actual loss of tree or plant as a result of the cold, there's some indemnification that can happen. Largely what happens is there are access to low interest loans, which in this financial situation would be attractive to farmers. But the other thing that happens is when you've documented the damage and the Farm Service Agency has it, there's an opportunity for Congress, in many cases, to do an ad hoc program. Part of a bill, they may add disaster assistance for, a region that may come 6 months or a year later, but there can be an ad hoc bill put through Congress to actually help growers in this area.
And without a federal disaster declaration and without, say, low-interest loans or, like you just mentioned, a bill from Congress, what other supports are there for farmers in the aftermath of a disaster declaration? Are there state programs they can turn to? Are there private insurance options that farmers typically utilize?
In the apple industry, apple crop insurance is fairly common.
Hmm.
Not all farmers take advantage of that, but given the vulnerability, particularly of the fruit crop in New York, many of our apple producers do carry crop insurance. It's got some limitations. If you have some fruit, haven't lost all of it, you've got those kind of issues to parse out. But many of our apple producers do have crop insurance. And we've learned some things that could be better in the crop insurance world with our apple producers as a result of this disaster as well. So their crop insurance guidelines are largely put in place by USDA and RMA, a division of USDA. So we're going to look at some ways and some recommendations to USDA to perhaps improve the way the coverage is carried for our apple producers.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Richard Ball, the Commissioner for the State Department of Agriculture and Markets. So the request for the disaster declaration was formally submitted on May 20th. What's the status of that request as we talk about a month later on June 16th?
We understand it's at USDA and being reviewed at this time. I want to point out, as I mentioned earlier, that a number of states were hurt by this cold night. We had 23 and 24 degrees. West Virginia and Virginia tell me they had 19 degrees, and their fruit was further advanced. Not just apples, but cherries, stone fruit, peaches, and some grapes. So we're looking at all of the above. And in addition to New York submitting its letter requesting disaster declaration of the Secretary, all the other states have done so. And together, we all wrote a letter requesting that the region be declared a disaster as well. So we're kind of reinforcing with the commissioners, secretaries, and directors in these states that it's an important thing for the Secretary to consider. I have every belief that she will.
Well, what happens in the interim before a declaration is potentially made or before loans are actually delivered? What are farmers doing? Are they seeing or having to grapple with a loss in revenue? Or because we're talking about, say, apples in some cases, this wasn't going to be an issue until harvest season in the fall, and thus they're not dealing with any sort of economic hardship yet?
Every farm is a slightly different situation. Some of them are pick your own operations. Some of them will be able to buy apples from another grower outside our region to be able to service their customers. Some are repackers and shippers, and in many cases, they're hurt the worst because they don't have a crop to sell and pack. So it affects everybody in a slightly different way. But right now, they still have to take care of the trees. They still have to make sure that the trees are healthy and free from, all the things culturally that the growers do when they take care of their orchards. So it's very hard because in many cases, it will cost the farmer more money to take care of a poor yield and a poor crop than it does to take care of a good crop. So we're still coming to grips with the exact losses. Sometimes a tree will push out additional fruit. Sometimes some of the blossoms that look like they're going to make it don't make it, and the fruit doesn't stay on there. It hit different varieties in different ways, different elevations in different ways. So we're still learning about the challenges, unfortunately, but it looks very serious. You mentioned $30 million, and I've heard numbers anywhere from $30 million to $60 million in impact to the region. So.
Well, when you talk about the effort to get a disaster declaration or, as you mentioned, potential action by Congress, is there a political calculation to, say, trying to advance a request from blue and red states so that this is more of a bipartisan concern? I mean, when I think about the number of counties that are part of this declaration request from the state, I mean, it's a lot of them, and from all corners of the state, blue and red counties. And I wonder whether that impacts this, or whether this is one of those few areas that you feel is free of political concerns, and that federal officials don't necessarily look at who was impacted and who maybe that region might vote for.
Well, I would hope there's no political consideration whatsoever Farmers who are red farmers or blue farmers or independent farmers all get hurt by cold the same. And food has really got to be agnostic about this. It's a matter of paperwork. In some cases, the Farm Service Agency, which is the USDA representatives on the ground in New York, sometimes they need to collect some data and have reporting and demonstrate the level of loss that's in the state. But I would hope that there's no political consideration here whatsoever.
Hope, but from your experience, does it seem like this is ever entangled in politics? I mean, you've got 12 plus years now running Department of Ag and Markets, so you've seen all sorts of administrations in the White House.
I have never seen a political implication to a disaster in my history.
In terms of other disasters this year or more recently, what's been the experience with, say, the Trump administration, this latest go-around? Have they granted any disaster declarations for New York's agriculture sector?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. Last winter, if you remember, we had an extraordinarily cold winter. We saw Long Island Sound freeze up, and we didn't realize it until after the ice began to melt on the Sound, the damage that was happening to the aquaculture industry down there. Principally oyster farmers, shellfish farmers who saw their nets and their traps and their crop actually be pulled away and loosened up from their moorings by the movement of ice. And Commissioner of DEC and I went down to look at the damage and talk with the aquaculture industry. And principally oyster growers were hurt the most. But at that time, we requested a disaster declaration. The governor put it in and was granted fairly quickly. So we have had a history of success in this regard.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with Richard Ball. He's a commissioner for State Department of Agriculture and Markets. Commissioner, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Yes, great questions, Dave. Thank you.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.